When we talk about abstinence, especially in the life of a woman, we're rarely just discussing a physical choice. We're entering a landscape woven with psychology, longing, shame, rebellion, and the subtle wars of self-control. This is not simply about whether or not a woman has sex. It's about everything that her body, her psyche, and her soul are forced to negotiate in the silence left behind. Abstinence, in its deepest sense, is the moment when the body goes quiet and the unconscious begins to roar. Jung understood this. He saw in human sexuality not just a biological urge, but a vessel for the unconscious to speak, to rebel, to suffer, and at times to heal. In a world obsessed with sex as either a commodity or a sin, what happens to a woman when she is absent from its embrace? The answer is never obvious, never just a matter of missed pleasure. It is a labyrinth of hidden consequences. For many women, abstinence is not a matter of personal philosophy, but of circumstance, trauma, social pressure, or unresolved shame. The body becomes a battlefield, caught between the need for connection and the desire for safety. The psyche splits, one part craving intimacy and another fearing its cost. Jung would call this the beginning of a split within the self. He taught that what is repressed does not disappear. It sinks into the unconscious, gathering energy, becoming both wound and weapon. When a woman lives without sexual expression, that unspent energy transforms. Sometimes it becomes anxiety, sometimes resentment, sometimes a restless search for meaning in other domains. Work, spirituality, perfectionism, or even withdrawal from life itself. The unconscious, deprived of one outlet, will always search for another. But abstinence is not always forced. Sometimes, a woman chooses it deliberately, perhaps as a form of healing, perhaps to regain control after trauma, or perhaps out of spiritual conviction. Even then, the consequences are not simple. The suppression of sexual energy does not create purity. It creates pressure. Jung called this process enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme to give birth to its opposite. Denied desire returns, often disguised, often intensified. The woman who turns her back on sexuality may find it haunting her dreams, invading her thoughts, or emerging as a peculiar anxiety, a sense of restlessness that cannot be named. In the silence of the body, the soul begins to speak, but not always in a language she recognizes. Consider how modern society approaches female abstinence. The absence of sex in a woman's life is often met with suspicion, pity, or sanctification. She is either seen as lacking, as damaged, as a prude, or, paradoxically, as a moral beacon. None of these projections belong to her. They're the collective's attempt to explain away the discomfort her abstinence provokes. Jung would recognize this as the shadow at work, a society projecting its own unresolved tensions around sex onto those who don't conform to its rules. The woman who abstains, willingly or not, becomes a mirror for others' anxieties and fantasies. In her silence, their discomfort grows. But what is happening inside her? When sexual energy is not given expression, it does not die, it transforms. Jung saw libido not as mere sexual drive, but as life energy, psychic fuel that seeks expression in 1,000 forms. When it cannot move outward, it turns inward. For some women, this becomes creativity, a burst of artistic output, an obsession with self-improvement, a restless perfectionism. For others, it becomes anxiety or depression, a gnawing dissatisfaction with everything and nothing at once. Some will pour this energy into work, into caring for others, into spiritual pursuits that border on obsession. The outer life may look fine, but beneath the surface, a storm is brewing. And yet, abstinence is not only deprivation. For some, it can be a period of immense clarity, a time when the body's needs fade and the mind sharpens. Jung wrote that in the absence of one form of energy, another is always waiting to be born. Some women find, in abstinence, a strange freedom, the removal of sexual obligation, the escape from the pain of bad relationships or the disappointments of desire unmet. In this vacuum, they may discover parts of themselves that were once lost: strength, focus, intuition. But even this freedom comes at a price. The denied energy will always seek expression. The more it is denied, the more insistent it becomes, eventually forcing itself to the surface, sometimes as creativity, sometimes as illness, sometimes as a sudden, irrational hunger for experience. We cannot ignore the influence of the collective unconscious. Every woman carries within her the archetypes of the lover, the mother, the maiden, and the crone. Each of these demands recognition. Each seeks a place in her life. When sexuality is suppressed, the archetype of the lover often goes underground, manifesting as longing, dreams, or even self-sabotage. Jung taught that what is not made conscious will be lived out as fate. The woman who denies her sexuality may find herself drawn to destructive relationships, or she may retreat into isolation, convinced that her desire is dangerous. The unconscious does not care for moral laws. It cares for balance. Where there is suppression, there will be compensation. This is the beginning of a journey, one that is not simply about sex, but about wholeness, shadow, and the reclamation of self. When a woman's body goes silent, her soul does not sleep. It stirs, it mourns, it waits, and sometimes it rebels in ways she cannot predict. Abstinence, whether chosen or forced, is never a neutral act. It is a summons from the depths, an invitation to confront everything she has hidden, denied, or forgotten. It is the soul's way of forcing her to listen, and what she hears in that silence may change her forever. If the beginning of abstinence is a confrontation with the unconscious, then the next phase is a reckoning with the personal shadow. The woman who lives without sex, by choice, circumstance, or trauma, cannot escape the psychological reverberations set in motion by this void. In the absence of intimacy, she is left alone with herself. Jung argued that the shadow is everything in us we do not wish to acknowledge. In sexual abstinence, the shadow is often made up of shame, unmet longing, self-doubt, and the inherited voices of culture and family. The absence of sex becomes a crucible where all these shadow elements are magnified. No distraction, no anesthesia, just the unfiltered truth of her inner landscape. This confrontation can be harrowing. As the days, weeks, or years pass, a woman may find herself haunted by unresolved memories, past lovers, betrayals, rejections, or traumas she thought she'd buried long ago. Sexual abstinence, especially when prolonged, acts as a magnifying glass for old wounds. The psyche, denied one form of satisfaction, begins searching for compensation in the past. Memories resurface, the first heartbreak, the feeling of being unwanted, the moments of deep vulnerability. Jung knew that what is left unprocessed in the shadow does not go away. It simply changes form, emerging as anxiety, self-criticism, or an inexplicable heaviness. In this phase, many women unconsciously adopt new coping mechanisms. Some throw themselves into work, hobbies, or caretaking, attempting to fill the emptiness with activity. Others retreat into fantasy or the digital world, chasing a fleeting sense of connection through social media or fiction. Still, others become hyper-independent, convincing themselves that they do not need anyone, that self-sufficiency is all that matters. But beneath these strategies lies a deeper struggle, the fear of vulnerability, the ache for genuine intimacy, and the persistent question of worth. Abstinence, for many, is not a proud declaration, but a fragile truce with loneliness. This loneliness, however, is not simply social. It is existential. Jung described loneliness as not the absence of people, but the impossibility of communicating one's deepest truths. For a woman who abstains from sex, this sense of separation can feel all-consuming. She may be surrounded by friends, family, even lovers from the past, but the distance between her inner world and the outer world grows. The less she shares of her true desires and fears, the more she feels like a stranger in her own life. This is the shadow of abstinence. It brings into focus the parts of herself she has learned to hide. Yet, in this confrontation with loneliness and the shadow, something unexpected begins to occur. The woman starts to see herself more clearly, without the distractions of physical intimacy or romantic entanglements. She is forced to listen to the quiet voice of her own soul. Questions that once could be drowned out by external validation now become impossible to ignore. What do I truly want? What am I afraid of? Where does my worth come from? The silence of abstinence creates space for these questions, but the answers are rarely easy or comforting. For some, this process leads to self-rejection. The shadow, when left unchecked, can become overwhelming, whispering lies of inadequacy and failure. A woman may blame herself for her abstinence, believing she is unlovable, broken, or unworthy of pleasure. These beliefs, left unchallenged, can calcify into depression or self-sabotage. Jung warned that the shadow, if not integrated, turns against the self. The key is not to defeat the shadow, but to bring it into consciousness, to make peace with it, to listen to its messages, to learn from its pain. Other women, however, find in this process a rare kind of freedom. They realize that abstinence is not necessarily a curse, but a chance to reclaim sovereignty over their own bodies and desires. The absence of sex removes the constant background noise of seeking approval or performance. In its place emerges a new sense of autonomy, a refusal to define oneself by romantic success or failure. This autonomy, however, is fragile and must be cultivated. Without conscious effort, it can easily tip into isolation or emotional numbness. True autonomy is not the absence of need, but the acceptance of need as part of the human experience. What happens next depends on how a woman chooses to respond to this new self-awareness. For some, abstinence becomes a platform for creative or spiritual growth. The energy that once moved outward now fuels art, music, writing, or a search for meaning that transcends the physical. Jung called this sublimation, the process by which instinctual drives are transformed into higher forms of expression. But sublimation is not always graceful. It is often born of desperation. The pain of abstinence can push a woman to reach new heights, but can also lead her to the brink of collapse if the underlying needs are ignored. For others, abstinence becomes a mirror for societal expectations. Women are constantly told what their sexuality should look like: desirable but modest, passionate but controlled, available but not too much. In the absence of sexual activity, these contradictory messages grow louder. A woman may feel judged for not participating, or she may be praised for her purity. Either way, Her sexuality becomes a battleground not only for her own soul, but for the culture she inhabits. Jung understood that collective expectations can be as imprisoning as personal trauma. To live authentically, a woman must learn to distinguish between her own desires and those imposed from outside. Ultimately, this phase of abstinence is a crucible, a place where the shadow is burned away or where it grows stronger. The outcome depends not on circumstance, but on consciousness. To emerge from abstinence whole, a woman must confront her loneliness, embrace her shadow, and reclaim her autonomy. She must learn to live in the silence without letting it become a tomb. Only then does abstinence become not just an absence, but a space for transformation. As the experience of abstinence deepens, the woman moves beyond mere confrontation with her shadow. Now, the psyche begins to adapt, to compensate, to seek equilibrium in unexpected ways. This is where the transformation quietly unfolds, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a slow, almost invisible reshaping of her inner world. Jung believed that every deprivation sets in motion the search for compensation. When sexual expression is removed from a woman's life, the instinct for fulfillment does not disappear. Instead, it moves into the background, disguising itself, re-emerging as subtle symptoms, compulsions, or even strange new desires that she may not recognize as connected to her abstinence. At this stage, many women notice subtle changes in their emotional lives. The body, denied its traditional outlet for tension and longing, begins to manifest its restlessness in other domains. Sometimes it appears as a heightened sensitivity, a sharper awareness of beauty, art, or music. Sometimes it takes a darker turn, anxiety, irritability, or an inexplicable heaviness in the chest. Some experience sleeplessness, others a loss of interest in social connection. Jung observed that psychic energy, when blocked in one area, will seek expression elsewhere. For a woman living without sexual intimacy, this energy can become a double-edged sword, a source of potential creativity, or, if ignored, a seedbed for psychological distress. One common path of compensation is the pursuit of perfection. Without intimacy to anchor her in the body, a woman may unconsciously try to control the rest of her environment. The house must be spotless, the work flawless, the routine unbreakable. This is not simple diligence. It is an attempt to fill the void, to create order where something wild and chaotic once lived. Jung called this the tyranny of the animus, the inner masculine principle, which, when unchecked, pushes the psyche toward rigidity, criticism, and relentless self-discipline. The woman becomes her own harshest judge, unable to relax, unable to forgive herself for minor flaws. The drive for control is merely the shadow of unexpressed longing. Others may find themselves swinging to the opposite pole. The absence of sex, rather than leading to rigidity, dissolves boundaries. Old appetites return in new guises. Compulsive eating, obsessive shopping, risky behaviors, or emotional entanglements that serve as a substitute for true intimacy. The unconscious is creative but ruthless. If it cannot find nourishment in connection, it will seek it in sensation. For some women, this means a cycle of fleeting pleasures, each one promising relief but delivering only emptiness. Jung warned that when instincts are ignored or demonized, they become distorted, demanding attention in ever more disruptive ways. Spirituality often emerges as another channel for unspent energy. Many women in abstinence experience a sudden attraction to meditation, yoga, esoteric practices, or intense forms of prayer. On the surface, these are healthy outlets. But if pursued as a way to bypass the body, rather than to integrate it, they can deepen the split within. Jung respected the search for the numinous, the sacred, the mysterious. But he also cautioned against spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to avoid facing unresolved wounds and denied desires. True transformation does not come from escape, but from integration. The body, in its wisdom, cannot be left behind. Relationships with others inevitably shift as well. Friends may notice changes. The woman becomes more withdrawn, or conversely, more outspoken. She may become hyper-aware of sexual content in media, or she may develop a quiet resentment toward those who seem fulfilled in their relationships. Some women will find their patience for shallow interactions has evaporated. Only depth feels bearable. Jung wrote that libido, when repressed, often seeks sublimation in the search for meaning. This can make the abstinent woman intensely philosophical, critical of the superficial, restless in the face of small talk and pretense. She may develop a yearning for authenticity so acute that it isolates her further. But there is another possibility: the emergence of creative genius. The history of art, literature, and science is filled with figures whose sexual energy, whether by choice or circumstance, was transformed into extraordinary accomplishments. Jung called this the alchemical process, the conversion of base instincts into gold. For some women, abstinence becomes the crucible in which new forms of creativity are born. Poems, paintings, businesses, causes, all may arise from the energy that once sought only touch. But this process is not automatic. It requires awareness, discipline, and a willingness to confront the pain beneath the surface. Without this, creativity becomes mere distraction, and the soul remains unsatisfied. Physical symptoms may also appear. The mind and body are not separate. For some, abstinence leads to somatic complaints, headaches, digestive issues, tension in the muscles, or changes in menstrual cycles. Western medicine often dismisses these symptoms, but Jungian psychology sees them as messages from the unconscious. The body speaks in metaphor. What cannot be expressed in words or action emerges as discomfort or illness. Ignoring these signals only deepens the split. Healing requires not just medical intervention, but a willingness to listen, to ask what the body is trying to communicate through its silence and its pain. At this stage, many women experience a profound ambivalence. On one hand, there may be pride in independence, in the discipline it takes to abstain, in the belief that they are no longer hostage to desire. On the other, there may be grief for lost opportunities, for the touch never felt, for the vulnerability that remains unshared. Jung understood this as the tension of opposites. Real psychological growth, he taught, happens not by choosing one pole over the other, but by holding both at once. To honor the gifts of abstinence without denying its costs. To allow both pride and sorrow, discipline and longing to coexist. This is the hidden reality behind the silence. Abstinence does not erase need. It reveals its complexity. The psyche adapts, compensates, transforms, but always at a price. Each adaptation, each new strategy, is both a solution and a signal. The task is not to rid oneself of desire, but to become conscious of its forms, its disguises, its wisdom. The woman who can do this, who can meet herself in all her contradictions, who can listen to both her longing and her discipline, begins to reclaim a kind of wholeness unknown to those who live only in fulfillment or only in deprivation. Here, in the heart of paradox, the real transformation begins. With each passing phase of abstinence, something essential in the woman's psyche begins to surface, a confrontation not just with what has been denied, but with the very meaning of desire itself. Abstinence is no longer just the absence of sex. It becomes a mirror that reflects her truest self, stripped of performance, external validation, and societal scripts. Jung wrote that the human soul is never satisfied with mere absence. It seeks to create meaning out of every experience, especially those that challenge comfort and expose hidden wounds. For the woman in prolonged abstinence, the journey is no longer about deprivation, but about an unrelenting search for understanding and integration. At this stage, the illusions that once sustained her begin to fall away. She may have believed that abstinence would make her pure, untouched by pain or disappointment, or that discipline alone could rescue her from longing and vulnerability. Now, in the deep quiet that has settled around her life, these beliefs reveal their hollowness. She sees how much of her identity was tied to being desired, to being chosen, to the idea that love or validation must come from another. With each layer she peels back, she faces the naked truth. The longing was never only for a body or a partner, but for a feeling of being fully alive, of being seen, accepted, and mirrored at her core. Yet in this stripped-down state, a strange and unexpected grace appears. Jung called it individuation, the process by which a person becomes truly herself, not by conforming to roles or expectations, but by integrating every aspect of her nature, light and shadow, strength and fragility, desire and restraint. The absence of sex, which once felt like a punishment or a void, becomes the very space in which this individuation unfolds. No longer distracted by the demands of others, the woman turns inward, confronting the full spectrum of her needs and limitations. The silence that once echoed with loneliness now hums with potential. Relationships take on new meaning. Having faced her own shadow, the woman becomes less willing to tolerate superficial connections. She can no longer accept relationships based on convenience, habit, or fear solitude. Instead, she craves authenticity, real intimacy that welcomes her as she is, without performance or pretense. Some friendships fall away, unable to withstand the shift in her energy. Others deepen, drawn by her newfound clarity. For many, this period is marked by solitude, not as exile, but as sanctuary, a time to rebuild boundaries and learn the art of self-containment. At the same time, the question of trust resurfaces. In the absence of physical intimacy, trust must be rebuilt from within. Can she trust herself to be enough? To endure loneliness without collapsing into bitterness or despair? Jung believed that the ability to trust oneself, to face the unknown without guarantees, was the hallmark of a mature psyche. The woman who remains conscious in her abstinence learns to honor her intuition, to sense when a situation is not aligned with her soul, to walk away without regret. This is a radical form of self-respect, born not from pride, but from the hard-won understanding that her value does not depend on being chosen. A new sense of purpose may begin to stir. Freed from the exhausting cycle of longing and disappointment, the woman often finds herself drawn to causes, projects, or paths she had long ignored. For some, this is a turn toward creative work, painting, writing, music, activism. For others, it's a deepening of spiritual practice, not as an escape from the body, but as a bridge between body and soul. The energy once consumed by romantic or sexual pursuit now fuels something larger than the self, an offering to the world, a legacy that outlasts momentary pleasure. But even as new horizons open, the longing never entirely disappears. It changes shape, sometimes becoming subtler, more refined. The ache for connection is transformed from desperation into quiet hope. The woman learns that longing is not her enemy, but a compass pointing her toward deeper layers of meaning and growth. Jung wrote that longing is the soul's way of moving us forward, of preventing stagnation, of ensuring that our stories remain alive. To suppress longing completely is to risk emotional death. To honor it is to remain open to life's continual unfolding. Yet there are dangers in this territory as well. Abstinence, if worn as a badge of pride or martyrdom, can become another prison. The risk is to mistake isolation for strength, to confuse numbness with peace. Jung warned that the psyche cannot be tricked for long. What is denied returns in dreams, symptoms, or moments of sudden irrationality. The challenge is to remain honest, to admit when abstinence has turned from conscious choice to avoidance, from an act of self-care to a strategy of hiding from the messiness of relationship and desire. For some women, this realization leads to a gentle re-entry into the world of connection, approached with new discernment, clear boundaries, and a fierce refusal to compromise the integrity gained through solitude. For others, it may mean accepting that solitude, at least for now, is the most truthful way to live. The point is not the outcome, but the consciousness brought to the experience. To live abstinently without bitterness, to love without clinging, to desire without losing oneself. This is the paradoxical wisdom gained only by walking through emptiness and emerging more whole. By now, the silence of the body is no longer something to be feared. It has become a teacher, a guide, a ground of being. The woman has learned that abstinence is not about denying her nature, but about meeting it fully, acknowledging every longing, every wound, every hope. In the emptiness, she has found her center. In the absence of touch, she has discovered her own hands. The journey has not been easy. It has cost her certainty, comfort, and the illusions that once passed for love. But it has given her a truth that cannot be taken away, that she is enough, even in her emptiness, even in her longing, even in her silence. When a woman emerges from a long interior journey of abstinence, she is no longer the same. The path through deprivation, shadow, transformation, and individuation has carved out a new landscape within her, one defined not by lack, but by the wisdom that grows in silence. Jung wrote that the soul hungers for experience, for integration, for wholeness. The outward abstinence that began as circumstance or choice becomes, in its deepest sense, an alchemical process, a turning of pain into insight, longing into direction, emptiness into a sacred container for new meaning. Now, looking back, she can see the signs of her transformation in the smallest details. The restlessness that once haunted her is softer now, tempered by acceptance. Where there was once a desperate ache for connection, there is now the quiet confidence that she can weather loneliness without losing herself. Her longing remains, not as a wound, but as an ember, warming her from within, reminding her that she is alive. Jung believed that to be whole is not to be free of longing, but to befriend it, to let it guide us toward deeper layers of meaning and belonging. With this hard-won self-knowledge, her relationship to her body also changes. No longer is the body a battlefield of shame and denial. It becomes a source of wisdom and intuition. The aches, the tensions, the subtle signals, she learns to read them as messages, not punishments. She is less likely now to ignore her needs or to suppress desire out of fear or pride. Instead, she listens. What do I truly want? Where does my energy wish to flow? If she chooses abstinence again, it is not out of guilt or obligation, but from a place of sovereignty, of owning her choices and their consequences. Her connections with others deepen, even if her circle is smaller than before. Having confronted her own shadow, she is less easily fooled by the masks others wear. She values honesty above comfort, authenticity above approval. There is no longer any interest in shallow conversation or performative intimacy. Instead, she seeks real presence, whether in friendship, love, or even solitude. Jung taught that every meaningful relationship is an encounter of souls, a meeting of two people willing to show themselves as they are. The woman who has survived the silence of abstinence is now capable of this level of truth, both with herself and with those she allows close. The way she views love itself may also transform. Where once she sought completion in another, now she sees partnership as a meeting of equals, two individuals walking side by side, rather than two halves desperately trying to fill each other's emptiness. Abstinence has shown her that she is already whole, even in her longing. She is less likely now to accept crumbs of affection, to chase unavailable lovers, or to sacrifice her boundaries for the illusion of safety. The standard is higher, not from arrogance, but from hard-won clarity. She knows the cost of self-betrayal, and she is no longer willing to pay it. In her work, her art, her daily rituals, the transformation is subtle but profound. She creates not to impress, but to express. She serves not from compulsion, but from genuine care. The energy that once spun restlessly outward is now channeled with intention, focused on projects and relationships that truly matter. Jung's vision of individuation, a life lived in accordance with the deepest truth of the self, becomes a lived reality, not an abstract ideal. Even setbacks, disappointments, or renewed periods of loneliness are met with a new resilience. The woman has learned to trust herself, to stay when things are difficult, to leave when things are wrong, to begin again when necessary. Perhaps the greatest change, however, is her relationship to the unknown. Abstinence forced her to confront the parts of life that cannot be controlled, predicted, or neatly resolved. In surrendering to this uncertainty, she discovered a new form of faith, not in dogma or promises, but in her own capacity to adapt, to survive, and to grow. She knows now that nothing is permanent, that even the most intense longing can pass, that emptiness is never truly empty, but full of latent possibility. This acceptance does not make her passive. Rather, it frees her to engage with life more fully, to risk connection, to remain open even when vulnerability feels dangerous. There will be moments when the old ache returns, a night when loneliness feels sharp, a day when the desire for touch is overwhelming. But these moments no longer define her. She greets them as part of the human story, neither indulging nor denying, but simply allowing them to be. This is not detachment, but maturity, the ability to hold complexity without needing to resolve it, to contain longing without being consumed by it. Jung would say she has made the unconscious conscious. She has integrated the shadow, embraced the paradox, and emerged more whole. In the end, the journey through abstinence is not about triumph or failure. It is about awakening to one's own depth, about finding meaning in places the world tells us to avoid. For the woman who has walked this path, the question is no longer, what am I missing, but what am I discovering? She understands now that every emptiness holds a gift, that every silence contains the seed of a new voice. The lessons she has learned about longing, resilience, autonomy, and love cannot be unlearned. They shape the way she moves through the world, the way she relates, creates, and dreams. So, as she steps forward into whatever comes next, be it solitude, new intimacy, or simply another day lived in her own skin, she does so with a new kind of strength. Not the brittle strength of denial, but the supple resilience that comes from meeting herself in the dark and choosing, again and again, to remain awake. The soul, Jung reminds us, grows through what it suffers and survives. Abstinence, far from being an end, has become the crucible from which a richer, truer self is born. And in that truth, she is finally free. Not from longing, not from loneliness, not from the mysteries of the body, but from the need to run from any of it. She stands at the threshold of her own life, ready to claim whatever comes, knowing she is enough, exactly as she is.